Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into a figure everyone thinks they know, but whose true complexity, it often gets buried under that one simple label, suffragist.
Exactly. And that's the key, right?
We're talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and our mission today is to move her far beyond that simple pedestal. Our source material, and we have a wealth of it, it forces us to look at ECS, the writer, the constitutional theorist, the radical critic of religion.
And an activist whose ideas were often, way too far out, even for her own movement.
Yes. We want to get a handle on the surprising, often challenging scope of her thought and why she was really the absolute intellectual founder of American feminism.
It's an essential distinction to make, because while the eventual victory of the 19th Amendment is what she's remembered for, Stanton's work was fundamentally revolutionary. It set the stage for every major feminist issue that followed.
She wasn't just interested in the vote.
Not at all. She was interested in total equality. And that meant taking on property rights, reforming the deeply conservative institution of marriage and divorce, and maybe most dangerously of all,
launching a direct, sustained criticism of organized religion itself.
Right. She was the philosophical engine, the one who articulated why women were oppressed, even if her famous partner, Susan B. Anthony, was often the one managing the logistics of the fight.
And to really grasp that relentless intellectual drive, that root of her rebellion, we have to start at this defining moment of her childhood. It's a key nugget from her memoir, 80 Years and More. She was 10 years old. Her last surviving brother, Eleazar, died suddenly at age 20, just after graduating from Union College.
And the Cady household was just steeped in grief. Eleazar is the last of 6 sons to die before reaching adulthood. The loss was devastating.
So Elizabeth goes to comfort her father, Daniel Cady, a stern man but devoted, a high-ranking judge. She tries to assure him, tells him she'll study hard, that she'll try to be everything her brother had been.
And what does her grieving father, this pillar of the community and the law, say to his exceptional, devoted daughter?
He looks at her and says, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy."
Wow. And that moment, delivered by the most important man in her young life, it provided this indelible, deep psychological motive for her entire lifelong rebellion.
It had to.
The 10-year-old was made acutely, painfully aware of the conditional nature of her worth, that her ambition, her intellect, it was somehow diminished simply by her gender. It instantly framed her pursuit of equality not just as a political goal for others, but as a personal existential necessity. She carried that scar and that resolve for her whole life.
So let's delve further into this background. It's privileged, for sure, but also so emotionally complex. And it's what ultimately gave her the tools to wage that rebellion.
Elizabeth Cady was born in 1815 into one of the most prominent, wealthy families in Johnstown, New York. Her father, Daniel Cady, wasn't just a U.S. congressman. He was a New York Supreme Court justice and one of the richest landowners in the state.
So we're talking about a life of immense social standing, material comfort.
Absolutely. The family mansion sat grandly on the town square, and the sources say they employed up to 12 servants. This reflects a life completely removed from the common struggle of 19th-century domesticity. That wealth gave her an insulation and an access that very few women of her era enjoyed.
But the home itself was, it sounds like, a study in contrasts, politically and temperamentally.
Oh, completely. While her father was intensely conservative, a Whig who believed in established order, her mother, Margaret Cady, was strong-willed, imposing at nearly 6 feet tall, and held significantly more progressive views.
And that parental divide is crucial.
It is. Margaret supported the radical, uncompromising Garrisonian wing of the abolitionist movement. She was progressive enough that she even signed a women's suffrage petition herself in 1867.
So while Elizabeth is growing up surrounded by her father's legal conservatism, she's also constantly exposed to her mother's passion for radical, immediate social change. I think it's important we circle back to the immense grief that shadowed this home. You said it before, but Elizabeth was the 7th of 11 children.
And all 6 of the boys died before they could reach full adulthood.
It's just an unimaginable tragedy. And the series of losses had a devastating effect on her mother, Margaret, who became withdrawn and often depressed.
Right. The emotional environment of the house suffered severely. Much of the responsibility for raising Elizabeth and her 4 surviving sisters fell to the oldest daughter, Tryphena, and her husband.
So the loss of the male heirs didn't just affect her father emotionally. It also created this maternal void. It left Elizabeth looking outward for purpose.
That's a great way to put it. And it pushed her toward her education, which was, for a woman of that time, truly exceptional.
She attended Johnstown Academy until age 15, and she excelled. I mean, she wasn't just taking domestic classes, she was in advanced courses in math and languages.
She won second prize in Greek, became a skilled debater. This early exposure to rigorous academics was transformative. It proved to her early on that she was intellectually equal, if not superior, to her male peers.
But that reality then slams right into the societal barriers. She wanted to go to Union College, where her brother had studied.
But no colleges at that time accepted female students, period.
So instead, she had to settle for the Troy Female Seminary run by Emma Willard, which, while it was the best female academy of its day, it was still a step down.
A huge step down from the university education she craved. The frustration was palpable, and it pushed her back toward her father.
And this is where her legal knowledge was forged.
Yes. Because she wasn't allowed into the professional male sphere, she joined it indirectly. Her father's law office became her classroom. Daniel Cady, though stern, he recognized her intellectual curiosity and would bring her law books to study.
So she'd then participate in dinner table debates with his law clerks.
Exactly, giving her this deep, foundational, and very critical understanding of American law.
I find this fascinating. She's spending hours in his office, not just reading law texts, but observing the plight of the women who came seeking legal help from her father.
And she became intimately familiar with the doctrine of coverture.
Can you just quickly unpack that for us?
Sure. It was the English common law principle that essentially suspended a wife's legal existence during marriage. A woman was covered by her husband's legal identity.
So she saw firsthand how coverture left women without property rights, without the ability to sign contracts.
Without guardianship of their own children. That legal system wasn't abstract to her. It was the mechanism of oppression she saw operating daily on her father's clients.
And as if that wasn't enough radical influence, she also spent summers away at the home of her cousin, Gerrit Smith,
who was a major radical abolitionist, famous for being part of the Secret Six, the men who financed John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry.
So Smith's home was a revolutionary hotbed.
Totally. It exposed her to this powerful counterpoint to her father's conservative Whig politics. It showed her that radical reform wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a necessary political weapon.
And there's this one more detail from her memoir about her childhood, about slavery.
Right, the hidden history. The source material mentions she had 3 African-American manservants. One of them, Peter Thibaut, was likely enslaved until New York State emancipation in 1827.
And she recalls attending the Episcopal Church with him and her sisters.
But they were forced to sit in the back, away from the wealthy white families. So you have this young girl, already aware of the limitations placed on her sex, seeing the even more profound and brutal limitations placed on people based on their race.
It instills an early awareness of systematic injustice, which becomes immediately evident in her personal life. Let's look at her first major act of personal defiance, her marriage.
In 1840, she married Henry Brewster Stanton, a prominent abolitionist agent. Her father vehemently opposed the match, primarily because Henry had limited means, was often traveling, and his politics were far too radical.
Her choice itself was an act of independence, but the truly defining feature of the ceremony was the marriage contract itself.
She insisted on the omission of one crucial, traditional word: obey.
She later explained, with that characteristic defiance of hers, that she obstinately refused to obey one with whom I supposed I was entering into an equal relation.
This wasn't just symbolic. It was an active rejection of coverture applied to her own life. And she asserted her identity by consistently signing herself Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or E. Cady Stanton. She was never Mrs. Henry B. Stanton.
So for the next few years, between 1843 and 1847, they lived near Boston, which was, at that time, the vibrant hub of American intellectual and abolitionist thought.
And she thrived. The Stantons connected with the major figures of the era: Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Ralph Waldo Emerson. This environment let her sharpen her political and rhetorical skills.
But then the reality of domestic life dragged her back.
Right. In 1847, the family moved to Seneca Falls, New York, into a large house her father bought for them. An ironic twist, really. Her conservative father's wealth enabling her later radicalism.
By now, she's a mother to 7 children, or on her way to having 7. And while she cherished motherhood, she quickly found herself isolated and deeply dissatisfied.
And this is a critical humanizing point. She'd tasted high intellectual society, only to be trapped in this new, often frustrating domestic routine. Henry's career as a lawyer and politician meant he was frequently absent, sometimes for 10 months a year.
So she's left in Seneca Falls, managing a large household and 7 young children without the intellectual companionship she needed.
The sources describe her role as the stultifying role of women as wives and housekeepers. She was at a loss. How do you re-engage with social reform when you're so completely tied to the home? This personal isolation, the sense of wasted potential, it was the kindling, the catalyst was about to arrive.
And that catalyst arrived years before Seneca Falls, actually, during her honeymoon in 1840. She and Henry attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London.
The irony is just overwhelming. You have these abolitionists, men gathered to fight for freedom and human rights, and they vote overwhelmingly to exclude all women delegates.
Even those who were duly appointed by their own anti-slavery societies.
They forced the women, including American delegates like Lucretia Mott, to sit in a separate, segregated gallery, hidden from the main floor by heavy curtains.
And Stanton, a young bride on her honeymoon, was just appalled by this blatant, sickening hypocrisy.
She realized instantly that the fight for universal human rights was incomplete if it ignored the subjugation of women. It was at this convention that she met and quickly bonded with Lucretia Mott, the Quaker minister and abolitionist who was much older and far more experienced.
Mott became an immediate mentor.
Absolutely. Stanton had never even heard a woman speak publicly before. She was profoundly moved when Mott delivered a sermon in a local Unitarian chapel. Stanton credited this convention with focusing her interests squarely on women's rights. It was a moment of political epiphany born of personal insult.
And the cumulative effect of these experiences just reaches this critical mass in the summer of 1848, 8 years after London, a year after moving to Seneca Falls.
Lucretia Mott was visiting a nearby friend, and Stanton just vents her long accumulating discontent, her deep frustration with domestic isolation, legal powerlessness, intellectual stagnation to Mott, and 3 other progressive Quaker women.
Her outburst was so charged that, as she described it, she stirred herself and the rest of the party to do and dare anything.
And they agreed, on just 10 days' notice, to organize a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, which, given the short time frame and the radical nature of the concept, is astonishing they pulled it off at all.
Stanton took the lead as the primary author of the convention's foundational document, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments.
And she didn't write it from scratch. She modeled it directly, phrase by phrase, on the U.S. Declaration of Independence.
Which was a brilliant political move.
Absolutely. By adopting the exact language of the nation's founding document, when in the course of human events, and then inserting all men and women are created equal, she was grafting the demand for women's rights onto the very foundational principles of American democracy. It listed 18 grievances that women suffered under patriarchy.
While most of the grievances dealt with property rights, marriage, education, her most controversial resolution was the demand for women's right to vote, the elective franchise.
And this demand was so revolutionary it almost torpedoed the convention. When Henry Stanton saw it, he told his wife she was making the proceedings into a farce.
Even Lucretia Mott was initially disturbed by it.
Right. She argued it was too radical, too far ahead of its time, and would ultimately undermine the legitimacy of their other, more achievable demands.
And yet this demand became the defining revolutionary hallmark of the convention, and it only passed after strong vocal support from abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass, who attended.
His presence and his articulate defense helped legitimize the idea for many attendees who were skeptical. And the Declaration of Sentiments became the single most important factor in spreading news of the movement, largely because of the controversy surrounding the ballot resolution.
It put women's suffrage squarely on the national map.
For better or for worse, yes.
What's fascinating is that while she championed these radical ideas, Stanton still struggled with, the logistics of radical implementation. She later spoke against the election of Abigail Bush as chair of the subsequent Rochester Women's Rights Convention.
Yes, it shows that even the most radical thinkers are not immune to issues of class or control. It was a historic first for a woman to chair such a meeting, and Stanton briefly lapsed into a more traditional, perhaps hierarchical view of leadership.
To her credit, though, she quickly acknowledged her error.
She did. She apologized publicly for her mistake, proving her commitment to learning and growth.
Moving into the 1850s, Stanton's focus was intensely practical, driven by what she'd seen in her father's law office. Let's dive deeper into curvature. How did this system practically intersect with her father's wealth? Was his support for property law reform truly progressive, or was it purely financial self-interest?
That's a brilliant question, because it reveals the pragmatic, self-interested side of reform. Under common law curvature, the husband owned the wife's property. If her husband incurred debt, her property, if she had any, could be seized by his creditors.
So even though Daniel Cady was conservative, the New York legislature began addressing this with the Married Women's Property Act of 1848. This law allowed wives to retain property acquired before or during the marriage.
And her father's support was almost certainly financial self-interest disguised as benevolence. Having lost all 6 sons, he wanted to ensure that his considerable wealth, when inherited by his 4 surviving daughters, would be protected from the potential financial mismanagement or debts of their husbands.
It was estate planning through political lobbying.
Exactly.
But Stanton and Anthony took that small, self-serving gain and weaponized it for true equality. Anthony organized massive petition campaigns, and Stanton successfully lobbied for an improved law in 1860.
The 1860 law was comprehensive. It guaranteed married women the right to their own earnings, to sign contracts, to sue and be sued, and to be joint guardians of their children. And Stanton argued forcefully that women needed the vote, not just for symbolic reasons, but for concrete legal protection. Without the ballot, these property gains were perpetually vulnerable.
She masterfully highlighted the similarity between the legal status of women and enslaved people.
She did. She then championed temperance and divorce reform, which were deeply intertwined. For Stanton, temperance wasn't about moral purity. It was about survival. Under existing laws, women had no recourse against drunken, abusive husbands who could leave their families destitute.
So in 1852, as president of the Women's State Temperance Society, she delivered a keynote address calling for drunkenness to be legal grounds for divorce.
Which immediately outraged religious conservatives who viewed marriage as an unbreakable covenant no matter what.
And she urged women to seize control, famously saying, "Let no woman remain in relation of wife with the confirmed drunkard."
This stance was so revolutionary that it led directly to her being voted out as president the following year. It shows you the political cost of her comprehensive vision.
But her conviction didn't waver. Later on the lecture circuit, she made divorce her perennial hot topic, defining it purely as a civil contract that should be dissolvable if it failed to produce happiness. It's a very secular, modern viewpoint.
And finally, we have to mention the visual defiance, dress reform. In 1851, following her cousin and with Amelia Bloomer, Stanton adopted the Bloomer dress, pantaloons under a knee-length dress.
She wore them for 2 years. A purely pragmatic choice, she said, made it easier to climb stairs with a baby in a candle.
But the societal reaction was overwhelming. It was met with intense ridicule. Traditionalists saw it as a profound threat to the social order.
And Stanton ultimately made a pragmatic choice and abandoned the style. She reasoned that the constant controversy over her clothing was distracting from the primary women's rights campaign. She learned early that you have to choose your battles,
Even if you are Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
So the movement truly finds its organizational voice in the 1850s thanks entirely to this dynamic duo. Susan B. Anthony meets Stanton in Seneca Falls in 1851.
And this meeting was the single most important turning point for both their careers and for the trajectory of American feminism.
It was a decades-long partnership built on perfectly complementary skills.
Absolutely. Stanton was the intellectual engine, the thinker, the writer, as she put it. I forged the thunderbolts. Anthony was the hands-on organizer, the tireless campaigner, the logistics expert. She was the one who, in Stanton's words, fired them.
Before we move on, I want to linger on that personal dynamic because this is where the human element of political organizing becomes so visible. She was a mother dealing with massive isolation and 7 children. How much of her radical focus on issues like divorce was rooted in that personal, isolated frustration?
Oh, it was absolutely central. Anthony, who was unmarried and free to travel, essentially became a co-parent. She would stay at the Stanton home, supervising the children, keeping the household running, while Stanton was sequestered in her study, writing the powerful speeches Anthony would then deliver across the state.
Anthony became, as biographers note, almost another mother to Mrs. Stanton's children.
That symbiosis is remarkable. Stanton created the intellectual blueprint. Anthony ensured the message was physically delivered.
And their shared political muscle first manifested nationally during the Civil War. They paused their specific focus on women's suffrage, recognizing the immediate necessity of abolition.
In 1863, they organized the Women's Loyal National League, the first national women's political organization in the U.S., with Stanton as president.
Their goal was abolition, specifically campaigning for the 13th Amendment. But their method demonstrated sheer organizational force.
The League collected nearly 400,000 signatures in a petition drive. That's an enormous feat, representing about 1 in every 24 adults in the northern states. It was the largest petition drive in U.S. history up to that time.
And the League served a dual purpose.
It did. While assisting abolition, Stanton ensured they passed resolutions calling for equal rights for all citizens, regardless of race or sex. She masterfully used the League to remind the public that petitioning was the only political tool legally available to women, establishing their national political reputations.
After the war, that powerful alliance faced the single greatest constitutional crisis of the 19th century, which led directly to the Great Rift that fractured the movement.
The proposed 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to African Americans, but, and this is the key, it introduced the word male into the Constitution for the first time in connection with voting rights.
This was terrifying for them. It constitutionally entrenched sex discrimination. Stanton was prophetic, fearing it would take a century at least to get it out.
And she was nearly correct. They immediately organized the American Equal Rights Association, or AERA, in 1866 to campaign for universal suffrage for all citizens, regardless of race or sex.
But they met immense resistance from their former allies. This is the moment of the Negro's hour.
Right. Men like Horace Greeley urged them to abandon the women's cause temporarily and focus only on black male suffrage. He said, "I conjure you to remember that this is the Negro's hour." Abolitionist leaders demanded women's rights stand aside.
And Stanton and Anthony flatly refused.
This strategic refusal led to financial desperation. During the 1867 Kansas campaign for universal suffrage, when expected abolitionist funding was blocked, they made a highly controversial decision.
They accepted financial help from the wealthy businessman George Francis Train,
Who was a political disaster. He openly disparaged African Americans and attacked the Republican Party.
So why would Stanton, a lifelong abolitionist, accept support from such a divisive figure?
It was ruthless pragmatism. Stanton defended the move by arguing that they'd been abandoned by their moral allies. She famously said she would accept support from the devil himself if he supported women's suffrage. The ends justified the means for her.
But this alliance profoundly alienated old friends and supporters.
And the final split occurred over the 15th Amendment, which proposed to enfranchise black men by prohibiting the denial of suffrage based on race. Stanton and Anthony vehemently opposed it, demanding universal suffrage for all be achieved simultaneously.
Stanton argued powerfully that this amendment would create an aristocracy of sex.
By constitutionally elevating all men, including poor, illiterate, or formerly enslaved men over all women, regardless of their own class or education, it formalized a new form of male dominance.
But the rhetoric she employed during this bitter debate was, well, it was deeply regrettable, rooted in class elitism and prejudice.
Her language, published in their newspaper The Revolution, quickly devolved into racially condescending terms.
She used elitist arguments, saying she would oppose laws being made for educated women by the votes of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Young Tongue.
That quote reveals a profound intersection of her anxieties. She feared the domination of educated women by ignorant men, whether they were Irish, Black, German, or Chinese immigrants.
And she specifically asked whether they should stand aside and let Sambo walk into the kingdom first. This elitism drew a powerful rebuke from her old friend Frederick Douglass.
Douglass strongly supported women's suffrage, but insisted that suffrage for African American men was a matter of immediate urgency, calling it literally a matter of life and death in the post-Civil War South. He argued that white women, regardless of their lack of the ballot, still held significant influence through their male relatives, a privilege not afforded to black men.
However, the complexity remains. Sojourner Truth, herself an abolitionist and former slave, actually supported Stanton's fear that if colored men gained rights and colored women did not, the men would simply become masters over the women.
Regardless of the nuance, the combination of the controversial strategy and the inflammatory rhetoric led to the dissolution of the EERA in 1869. This fractured the unified reform front, turning allies into rivals. Stanton and Anthony, however, they just doubled down.
Out of the rubble of that AERA split, Stanton and Anthony immediately focused on establishing their own institutional infrastructure. This began in 1868 with the launch of their weekly newspaper, The Revolution.
Stanton was co-editor, focusing on the powerful editorial content, while Anthony managed the immense business aspects, including securing that initial controversial funding from George Francis Train.
And Stanton specifically chose the paper's radical name.
She did. She reportedly declined funding offers that were contingent on changing it to something more palatable.
The paper's motto encapsulated their comprehensive vision. Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights, and nothing less. The revolution covered far more than just suffrage. It tackled politics, the labor movement, finance.
They dreamed of growing it into a daily paper owned and operated entirely by women. But that dream was short-lived. Train's financial support vanished quickly, and after only 29 months, the mounting debts forced them to transfer the paper.
And this is where the profound contrast between their dedication to the cause and their personal constraints emerges sharply. The paper had a $10,000 debt.
And Stanton, citing her 7 children and the necessity of focusing on her family, refused to take on responsibility for it.
So Anthony took it on herself.
That's right. Anthony viewed the debt as a moral obligation to the movement. She spent the next 6 years repaying the entire amount through extensive, grueling paid speaking tours. This act solidified her reputation as the uncompromising organizational martyr.
Their organization was then quickly formalized. In May 1869, 2 days after the ADRA split, they formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, or NWSA.
With Stanton as president, and this created a direct rival to the AWSA, led by their former ally, Lucy Stone.
And it's important to understand the strategic difference here.
Absolutely. The NWSA, reflecting Stanton's radicalism, was politically independent, focused on a national constitutional amendment, and concerned itself with a wide range of social issues: divorce, equal pay, religious criticism.
While the rival AWSA was more conservative, aimed for ties with the Republican Party, and focused solely on the achievable goal of a state-by-state suffrage strategy.
The NWSA's revolutionary zeal drove their initial legal tactic, the New Departure Strategy, adopted around 1871.
This legal theory argued that the newly ratified 14th Amendment implicitly enfranchised women by guaranteeing the privileges and immunities of citizens.
So the NWSA adopted this, encouraging hundreds of women across the country to attempt to vote and file lawsuits if they were denied.
This resulted in Susan B. Anthony famously voting in the 1872 election, leading to her arrest and highly publicized trial. Stanton even attempted to vote in 1880.
But the strategy ultimately failed in 1875 when the Supreme Court ruled in Minor v. Happersett.
Can you unpack that ruling? It's a crucial legal point.
The court actually agreed that women were citizens of the United States. However, they ruled that the Constitution does not define voting as a privilege of national citizenship. Essentially, the court said the 14th Amendment granted citizenship, but not the right to vote. Voting rights remained under the jurisdiction of the individual states.
So it completely shattered the New Departure approach.
It did. But undaunted, they shifted strategy. In 1878, Stanton and Anthony convinced Senator Aaron A. Sargent to introduce the specific constitutional amendment into Congress that would, 40 years later, become the 19th Amendment. They literally drafted the text.
Simultaneously, they recognized the need to control their narrative. Beginning in 1876, they undertook this immense biased project, The History of Woman Suffrage.
Originally envisioned as a small book, it swelled over 41 years into a 6-volume, 5,700-page opus.
Stanton wrote most of the first 3 volumes, an undertaking of epic scale. And it served a dual purpose, preserving documentation and shaping the historical record to favor their own organization.
Oh, the bias is undeniable. While it preserved an enormous amount of historical material that might otherwise have been lost, it consistently overstated the role of Stanton and Anthony and intentionally marginalized or ignored their rivals, particularly Lucy Stone and the AWSA wing. It was a preemptive strike to ensure their radical perspective was the dominant historical record.
And it took the intervention of Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, to force some necessary balance.
Right. Harriet wrote a 120-page chapter on Stone and the AWSA to lend credibility to the massive history, suggesting even those closest to Stanton recognized the project's political slant.
So how did Stanton support all this effort while raising a family and campaigning?
From late 1869 until 1879, she became a professional activist on the Redpath Lyceum lecture circuit, traveling 8 months of the year, often speaking in small, distant communities.
This provided her with necessary welcome financial independence. Her earnings were remarkable for the era. She reported clearing $2,000 above expenses in her first 3 months on the road,
which our sources estimate is equivalent to about $65,200 today. Since her husband's income was erratic, this money was crucial for supporting their 7 children.
More than just income, the Lyceum Circuit provided a powerful platform for the mass dissemination of her radical ideas. Her most popular lecture was Our Girls, urging young women toward financial independence and self-fulfillment.
But she also lectured on deeply challenging topics like the antagonism of sex, co-education, and her perennial lightning rod, marriage and divorce.
And she often reserved Sundays for her most controversial topic, The Bible and women's rights, directly challenging traditional religious authority and foreshadowing her final explosive act of defiance.
She was using this vast, accessible platform to prepare the American public for ideas they weren't yet ready to hear.
Which brings us to Stanton's final radical phase, spanning the 1890s and early 1900s. In 1890, the two rival suffrage organizations finally merged as the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NASA.
And Stanton was its first president, largely as an honorary figurehead, since she almost immediately left the country for 18 months to stay at her daughter's home in England.
When she declined a re-election in 1892, she delivered what is widely considered her finest speech, The Solitude of Self.
She delivered it 3 times in as many days, twice to congressional committees, framing it as a political document, and once to the NASA convention, framing it as a philosophical statement.
And this speech rejected the prevailing Victorian belief that women were defined solely by their relationships, as daughters, wives, or mothers.
Her core message was profoundly philosophical and utterly modern. She argued women must acquire inner strength, education, and political rights because no matter how much women prefer to lean, they must make the voyage of life alone.
The power of that sentence is immense. It's an assertion of self-sovereignty, that in moments of crisis, hardship, or death, you stand alone.
Therefore, women must be fully equipped, legally and intellectually, to navigate that solitary journey. It was a unifying philosophical masterpiece.
Unfortunately, that unifying moment was followed just 3 years later by the biggest rupture of her career, the woman's Bible controversy.
Her religious views have been evolving for decades, moving toward a Unitarian transcendentalist belief that individuals could determine religious truth for themselves, independent of rigid, male-dominated authority. She believed God need not be male.
So in 1895, at the age of 80, she published the first part of the Woman's Bible, a critical examination of the text that challenged its divine status.
Stanton wrote most of it herself, employing a method known as redaction criticism, meticulously scrutinizing passages from a woman's point of view, often using sarcasm and sharp analysis to critique the text.
Her premise was radical in the extreme for the era.
It was. She argued the Bible's attitude toward women reflects prejudice from a less civilized age, not the inspired, infallible Word of God. She targeted passages that subjugated women, like the creation narrative and the Pauline injunctions demanding women remain silent in church.
She explicitly denied core Christian tenets, stating, "I do not believe that any man ever saw or talked with God." She felt it was her special mission to tell people what they are not prepared to hear.
And despite the firestorm of outrage from conservative clergy and press, the book became a phenomenal commercial success, going through 7 printings in just 6 months.
But politically, it was a catastrophe for the suffrage movement. The younger generation of leaders in NASA, like Carrie Chapman Catt, saw her religious criticism as a monumental political liability.
They worried intensely about alienating conservative, mainstream women who were just beginning to join the suffrage cause. For them, securing the ballot was paramount, and Stanton's attack on the Bible was an unnecessary, damaging distraction.
The result was profound alienation. At the 1896 Nassau Convention, a resolution was successfully passed, despite Anthony's strong objection, to officially distance the organization from Stanton's book.
This decision deeply wounded Stanton and led to her growing increasingly alienated from the movement she had founded. The younger leaders began to actively sideline her.
And this alienation likely contributed to her final controversial political stance, her increased advocacy for educated suffrage.
In her last year, she began arguing for a constitutional amendment requiring an educational qualification, saying that everyone who votes should read and write the English language intelligently.
This stance was undeniably rooted in the class elitism and racial rhetoric she employed during the split over the 15th Amendment decades earlier. She argued against subjecting educated, virtuous women to the behests of such an aristocracy of ignorant men, whether foreign or native-born.
Even her own daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, critiqued this view, pointing out the hypocrisy of disenfranchising intelligent people simply because they lacked the opportunity for formal education. It was a dark elitist turn for an otherwise revolutionary figure.
Interestingly, she simultaneously explored other forms of political radicalism that seemed to contradict this elitism. She applauded the populist movement and identified with Fabianism.
Fabianism is a gradualist form of democratic socialism, advocating for social reform through incremental changes rather than revolution. And you have to ask why she would find this appealing.
It seems to align with her elitism.
It provided a framework for societal improvement that was rational, organized, and guided by a highly educated, competent class. A political philosophy that aligned perfectly with her belief that the educated should lead the ignorant.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902, 18 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. A final detail. Her last wish, to donate her brain to Cornell University for scientific study, was sadly not carried out.
Her death devastated her longtime partner. Susan B. Anthony wrote to a friend, "Oh, this awful hush. It seems impossible that voice is stilled, which I have loved to hear for 50 years. Always I have felt I must have Mrs. Stanton's opinion of things before I knew where I stood myself. I am all at sea."
Wow. That perfectly summarizes that even until the end, Stanton remained the movement's indispensable intellectual and philosophical bedrock.
Yet immediately after her death, she was subjected to a long period of historical marginalization. Anti-suffrage foes continued to use her radical statements on religion and divorce as ammunition against the movement.
So in a political act of damage control, younger suffragists strategically responded by belittling her role and glorifying Anthony, who had focused far more purely on the single, less controversial issue of the ballot.
Stanton was sidelined in the historical narrative for decades. The erasure was so effective that a 1923 ceremony marking the 75th anniversary of Seneca Falls made no mention of her, the primary force behind the event, until her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, insisted on paying tribute.
She only began to regain full recognition for her role as the true intellectual founder with the rise of the second-wave feminist movement in the 1960s.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've taken a deep dive into Elizabeth Cady Stanton and discovered a woman who was the true, radical driving force behind Seneca Falls, the tireless writer who crafted the movement's most potent documents, and Anthony's indispensable challenging partner.
Her radicalism on divorce, property, and especially religion defined her immense influence, but also complicated her relationship with the movement that eventually deemed her broad, complex vision too politically inconvenient.
Her most profound, enduring contribution is perhaps philosophical. Her fight for self-sovereignty best articulated in The Solitude of Self, arguing that women must be prepared to make the voyage of life alone.
It speaks directly to modern struggles for autonomy, financial, professional, and bodily. She understood deeply that true emancipation required challenging not just discriminatory laws, but the deeply held religious and social prejudices that underpin female subjugation.
And it leaves us with a potent final thought for you to consider. We've seen how Elizabeth Cady Stanton was pushed to the margins of history because her radical, comprehensive vision was seen as a threat to immediate political victory, the ballot.
So if a movement demands homogeneity, or risks alienating its base, how much radical truth is it willing to sacrifice for the sake of that immediate, quantifiable political goal? What essential parts of the core mission, the total revolution of society, get left behind in the pursuit of the simple strategic win?
Something to mull over as you weigh the cost of compromise against the price of truth.